Hi, everyone. I'm Ivo Dollar, President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and welcome to all of you who are joining us, our members and everyone else, for this important discussion on the state and nature and future of the U.S.-British special relationship. As a reminder, the Council is a nonpartisan, independent, and nonprofit organization, and so the views that you hear on our platform are those of the people expressing them and not of the Council. We're extraordinarily pleased to be able to host this conversation today on the special relationship 75 years after former Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. We're grateful to the embassy and indeed to the British Consul General here in Chicago for their support in organizing this program. And I'd like to acknowledge both Ambassador Pierce and Consul General Gokbashian for their support and their staff for making this possible. We will first have a fireside chat that I will have with Ambassador Pierce, and then Adam Roberts, the Midwest correspondent of The Economist, will moderate a panel discussion with the writer and historian Catherine Katz and the British Consul General in Chicago, Alan Gokbashian, and with Lawrence Geller. And now it's my honor to introduce our speaker today. Dame Karen Pierce is the British ambassador to the United States. She previously served as the United Kingdom's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York, among many other important positions in the British Foreign Service. Dame Pierce, thanks to ambassadors. Wonderful to see you again. Wonderful to have you, if not live, at least streaming here in Chicago and around the world. It's great to be able to spend a few minutes with you on this important issue. Let me start off with just asking where you think the relationship between our two countries has been and how it has evolved. If you look at the 75 years, this extraordinary time period in human history, and certainly in the relationship between our two countries, coming immediately after the victory in World War II, how do you think the relationship has evolved? What do you think are the main pieces we should be aware of?
Great. Well, let me start, Ivo, by thanking you very much. And it's really nice to see you again. You and I have worked on security issues before, going back quite a way. And thank you very much to the Council for asking me and for your cooperation with my colleague, Alan and Nick in the Consulate General. I think this is a fascinating question because if you think of the Missouri speech, Churchill also spoke about the Iron Curtain. And that is the immediate difference, I think, over this half of the relationship since 1945, over what you might think of as the first half. There is no longer a Cold War, there is no longer an arms buildup, and there is no longer a Soviet Union. Instead, we have myriad threats. We have the rise of China to contend with. We have a Russia that is disruptive, but less powerful geostrategically, but no less disruptive in a way. We have many more actors on the world stage to contend with, the new kids on the block, the emerging economies, and many of them have their own way of doing things. And you have, if you like, a competition set by China and Russia, who I think see great power dynamics as an opportunity to reset the rules of international affairs. Whereas I think despite all the difficulties and tensions of the Cold War, fundamentally, there was only one trajectory, and it was going in a Western and a Western values direction. And so I think one of the important things we have to do for the next 75 years is make sure we win that values war, and that we do it by convincing other countries that there's a more prosperous, a more open, a more transparent and democratic way ahead than an authoritarian one. So I think that's quite important. I think the other thing that's really changed, Ivo, is the business and commercial side. Back in 1945 and for the decades after, defense, intelligence, security. That was the bedrock of the special relationship. And that's still the same today, but it's been joined by many, many layers and interlocking schemes and ventures to bring our businesses and our trade and our commerce together. And that in turn has had enormous benefits for science and innovation. And I think if I highlight one last issue, it would be technology. I think we, as many people have said, we stand on the brink of a technological revolution in cyber, in AI, in quantum. This is obviously going to be important for the way we approach our allies and also our adversaries. But I think it's also the nuclear issue of its day, if you like. It is going to require, in my view, the same sort of transatlantic effort that we put into nuclear issues in the 1950s to fully make use of the technology and make sure that it's always there to benefit citizens rather than to spy on them.
I love the way you've encapsulated 75 years in 3 or 4 minutes. But
no, people can do it better.
I guess that's what great diplomats are able to do. And I think you push the envelope on a series of important issues. I want to press you on sort of one, which is that, of course, the relationship you describe is one that in many ways the United States has with many Western countries. There is a values base. There is a security base, there is an economic base, there's a challenge from the outside base. So what is it that is special about the special relationship in some ways? Of course, I'm not asking you to say why the US-UK is different or better than any relationship in another country, but what's special about it? What's different? Where does it go deeper? And to what extent is that structural? To what extent is it personal? To what extent is it geographic? How would you think about it in those terms?
I think the point of it is its scale and extent. It's all of the things you mentioned, and that in itself is unique. The UK is America's only ally with a global reach, a day one, night one capability, if you like. But I think you're right to suggest there's something more fundamental at work, Ivo. I think it goes back to Alexander Hamilton's "We think in English." There is something about the common law system, something about the approach to freedom, something about the level of ambition in support of prosecuting those freedoms that I think is very special. I won't say unique, but it's very special to both the US and the UK. And it is what has enabled us fundamentally to come together over the decades in all these shared adventures and endeavors in war and peace. And then it kind of breeds even more cooperation because the more you operate alongside each other, the more your technological developments reinforce each other, the more collaboration you have in science, and the more collaboration you have in science, the more your trading systems come to be very close and interwoven. But I think it does all come back to this approach to freedom, to a sense of if it's not forbidden, it's permitted. And that is a different philosophy than some other countries have, including countries in Europe.
Interesting. And that is a difference indeed. If you go to many countries on the continent, there are so many laws and so many regulations on day-to-day activities, and there is that common law difference that our two countries share as a key. Let me finally sort of talk a little bit about where we are today. It's not a secret, I think, that there was much anticipation in the change in administration from Donald Trump to Joe Biden, from a Republican administration that embraced Brexit and the direction that your government has pioneered over the last few years, and a Biden administration that, after all, came from a previous inclination to think that Brexit probably was not the wisest move, although accepting of the right of any country to make their own decisions, and the question of how the relationship between Joe Biden and Boris Johnson might evolve. We're only, what, 50 or so days into the administration. It's a little early, other than a number of phone calls. But how do you think the relationship is evolving today? Do you see the differences over that existed in the past being an obstacle for future collaboration, or do you see something different and more positive?
I think the first thing I'd say that it's, and Boris Johnson would say this if he were here, it's the job of any British Prime Minister to get on with, to cooperate with, to help the President of the United States of America, consistent, obviously, with our own interests and our own values. And you will always have differences between administrations and the British government of the day. You know, when I was first in Washington 25 years ago, we had some quite significant differences with President Clinton, some of them bilateral over Northern Ireland, some of them multilateral over Bosnia. And that was a huge fault line, transatlantic fault line at the time. But because of this bedrock of shared interests and common purpose that the UK and the US share, those differences can be managed. So I think that's the first thing to say. I think the second thing to say is that there's enormous affection from the peoples of both countries for the others, certainly from Britain towards America, and huge admiration. And that also keeps things moving forward. Boris Johnson and President Biden have spoken a couple of times since the president was elected. Those conversations have been long. They've been very warm. The statements out of the White House have been very warm. Secretary Kerry was in London yesterday talking about climate and said some very good things about the relationship. So I think it's off to a very good start. This year in particular, we have some things that are really going to drive close cooperation. So we both want to come out of the pandemic and build back better. We, the Brits, have the G7 presidency. We are using that to help get agreement on economic resilience, help support the COVAX idea of vaccines to the developing world, help pool our ideas on pandemic preparedness, and help build back in a greener, more sustainable, and hopefully a more equitable way. And those are things that President Biden, with his very strong focus on America, has to be strong at home if she's to be strong abroad. That's very much something we recognise. We recognise this idea that foreign policy has to be meaningful to ordinary citizens who don't spend all day thinking about it. It's got to be for the purpose of improving people's lives on the ground, both in our country and elsewhere. And then we have the really big issue of climate. The Italians will host the next big climate conference, COP26, in Glasgow in November this year. There's been a tremendous boost to climate efforts to see President Biden and Secretary Kerry bring America back into the Paris Agreement. And they are working at the moment on the sort of nationally determined contribution which we are sure will be ambitious and will help make a real difference towards reducing global warming. And I just want to pay tributes to all those governors and city halls who've been taking climate steps in the meantime. So this year in particular, Ivo, I think we're going to see a very strong set of steps where we not only collaborate with each other, but where we're feeding off each other's ideas and where the two leaders are getting together. And then we have NATO, in which you and I have a very strong interest. We've just announced an increase of $20 billion or so in our defense budget. We will shortly be bringing out an integrated review, which will say something about our approach to the world and to security. But I think people will find it has many points of identity with the US interim national security strategy that was published recently. So I think there's a lot to work on. And then lastly, I'll come back to tech again, if I may. We have got to get this tech approach right. You know, we want to win the international competition in tech, but we want to make sure that tech develops in a way that does do justice to transparency, democracy and open markets. And I think that's going to be a really important shared endeavor over the next few years. And of course, that is all linked to China. We've already started discussions with the American government on what is the best approach to China. I think we both want an outcome that sees a level playing field on trade, that ensures that there is security and stability in the Indo-Pacific and freedom of navigation, and one that really has human rights at the heart of the approach. So there's lots of areas there to be working on.
No, I think you've just laid out an incredible agenda for cooperation, an agenda that if that's the agenda from number 10, it coincides very nicely with the agenda from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, COVID right. First, of course, and dealing with that economic rebuilding, supporting and making sure that democracy thrives both at home and abroad, climate as a key issue, the security agenda that you and I have worked on for so many years, and of course the China issue. They'll keep both of our governments busy. It's gratifying to know and to see that as we begin the next leg of the special relationship, of the strong transatlantic relationship, we have governments who are looking at the challenges at least eye to eye, although no doubt they will have different at times about how to deal with them, but they will be dealt with cooperatively. Ambassador Pierce, thank you so much for joining us for this initial round. We're looking forward to a panel discussion, but it was great to have you especially here to kick this important discussion off. We hope to have you in Chicago soon.
Oh yes,
the weather is nice. So these days, believe it or not, so we'd love to have you back. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Ivo. I'd love to come back. You'll forgive me if I say people don't go to Chicago for the weather, but I'd love to come back regardless. Thank you very much.
Well, right now it's spring, so it's okay. But wait a minute, as they say. For our audience, again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For our audience, please hang on for a minute as we make our changes and have the panel discussion coming forward.
Well, I believe we've made our transition. So I hope, if unless someone tells me otherwise, I hope we can now move on to the panel discussion portion of this conversation. We have about 45 minutes to continue where the ambassador and Ivo began. Just reintroduce myself. I'm Adam Roberts. I'm the Midwest correspondent of The Economist publication. So I cover the Midwest, but I'm based in Chicago, and I can confirm that Ivo is right. We have absolutely stunning spring-like weather. So for all those naysayers in the rest of the world, Chicago does have the odd day of good weather. I'm delighted to welcome three panelists who can take us through a combination, I hope, of both the significant history that we're marking with the 75th anniversary of Churchill's speech in Missouri, and then the relevance of that history and the relevance of the relationship going forward, so we can cast this into the future as much as dwelling on the past. Ivo briefly introduced our panelists, but I'm going to do so again. We have Catherine Katz, who is a historian and author from Chicago and currently in Chicago, and crucially the author of a book that has been very well received and had much praise in newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal. The book is The Daughters of Yalta, the untold story of three intelligent and glamorous young women who accompanied their famous fathers to the Yalta Conference in February 1945 at the end of the Second World War. We have Lawrence Geller, who is both an accomplished businessman and entrepreneur, and also the chairman of the Board of Trustees for the International Churchill Society, who is joining us from London. And I'm sure London doesn't have anything like as good weather as we have in Chicago. And third, we have Alan Gogbashian, who is the British Consul General here in Chicago and has been here for an eventful 1 year, I think, or a year and a bit, perhaps the most dramatic year to have been here for some time. And from Chicago, he covers the 14 states of the Midwest on behalf of the British Diplomatic Services. So we have a cast of characters to look back and look forward on this subject. Catherine, could we begin with you, since you have this perspective on the Anglo-American relationship going back to the early days of the post-war period? Can you give us something of the context of what that period, somewhat before the Churchill speech that we're marking today, the significance of that for the relationship today?
Absolutely. It is the 75th anniversary of Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, in which he also outlined the phrase, the special relationship. It was not the first time that he'd used the phrase special relationship, and a lot of people associate it with the very deep personal friendship that emerged between Churchill and Roosevelt during the Second World War and grew in strength over the course of the war. It had its rocky moments as well. I certainly wouldn't say that it was smooth sailing throughout the entirety, especially by the end of the war in 1945, as Roosevelt was looking to build a stronger relationship with the Soviet Union and attempt to build a personal bond with Stalin, similar to what he had developed with Churchill over the course of the war. So unfortunately, by the end of towards the end of Roosevelt's life, it was not quite as strong as it had once been. However, it still was absolutely the bedrock of that alliance. Throughout the war, though, Churchill, he had previously used the phrase special relationship as early as 1944. And what's interesting is kind of how Churchill positioned Britain as part of three concentric circles. First, the relationship between Britain and Europe. Second, the relationship between Britain and the Commonwealth. And finally, the relationship between Britain and the transatlantic world, especially the United States. The first time that Churchill used the phrase, the special relationship, it was actually referring to both the United States and Canada. But that was slightly different than when he came to Fulton, Missouri in 1946 and spoke about a special relationship based on the strength of the English-speaking world. So again, including the Commonwealth as well as the United States, with an eye towards kickstarting American interest in defense in Europe as the threat of the Soviet Union was building. That, of course, changed later. It has come to mean at times also more of a transatlantic, more kind of broadly Atlantic alliance. But the special relationship has certainly matured and changed over time beyond just the friendship specifically between Churchill and Roosevelt built during the war years, which was very real and very strong.
Yeah, great. Well, we'll touch again on the history, but Lawrence, maybe I could turn to you and we could dwell a little bit more on the speech itself, because Churchill, of course, was out of office when he came to Missouri and gave his Iron Curtain speech. And I was reading a little bit about it today. And at first, I think the phrase Iron Curtain wasn't universally welcomed. It wasn't always seen as a great phrase. And yet, as time went on, it became seen as this absolutely prophetic comment. Could you just set out for us a little bit more, as Catherine began, the significance of that speech for the years that followed?
Well, I'm going to take you back for 2 minutes into the Russian Revolution, 1917, where Churchill was absolutely anti-Bolshevik, supported White Russians in an attempt to put down the revolution after a while. Failed in that attempt, but it was vehemently anti-Bolshevik. Of course, the Russians joined with the Germans for Poland and had an ally there, had an alliance. Eventually, Hitler turned on Russia, having not succeeded in the Battle of Britain, and decided to invade Russia, at which time Churchill confounded his critics by supporting Russia, by supporting the Soviet Union. And the Allies, the three Allies, and if you read Catherine's very poignant book, it's actually a brilliant story on the Allies, not just on three remarkable women. But the three Allies eventually defeated it, but there was a cost to each of them, and a cost of reinforcing Churchill's fundamental cynicism about the Russians, about the Soviets. And so he reverted back to the same warnings he gave to his own country in the 30s about the rise of Nazism. He reverted back to style. He reverted back to warning about the effects of Stalin's Soviet policy. And that was so, yes, you just come out from the bloodshed of however many tens of millions, 60 or 80 million people dead over a 6-year period. Nobody wanted to hear this warning. Everybody wanted to rebuild and start again and start fresh. But no, he put down this warning as a marker and hoped to get traction. Yes, he was derided quite a lot in his own country, clearly in the United States a lot, because people were sick of war. And he didn't want the, quote, warmonger to promote another one. So that's the background of it. And it's really important to note that his prescience was there. But then he did something unusual. He wanted to go back on his own history of summitry with many of the leaders of the Allies, and how he developed a very special personal relationship with Roosevelt. And he wanted to do the same and was convinced that he could do the same with Stalin and avoid this, quote, Cold War or avoid nuclear holocaust. He didn't, he failed. And that, I think, was probably one of the major things. But let me just say one thing that he said in his parting words, and then I'll stop talking. The parting words to Parliament in his last speech, he said, "Never be separated from the Americans." That was his parting words to Parliament. And I think that underpins this whole conversation today. So, Adam, thank you for letting me wax on ill-eloquently, but wax on.
Thank you, Lawrence. We'll be back to more waxing with you in a moment. Alan, I want to bring us forward a little bit and have you reflect, as Ambassador Pierce just did, a little bit more about the more recent relations between the US and the UK. And I'm struck by a column that the Financial Times columnist Philip Stevens wrote back in January, where he described the special relationship as being somewhat one-sided. He talked about the British investing the relationship with an almost spiritual significance, whereas the Americans tend to see it as more a sort of strictly business, and that we on the British side think it's an absolutely crucial, wonderful thing. The Americans give it more passing attention. Is that a fair comment from Philip Stevens?
Well, thanks very much, Adam, and apologies to everyone to bring you crashing back into the modern day. I was rather enjoying that historical moment and looking back from Catherine and Lawrence. Looking at, I don't agree with that characterization in the Financial Times. Certainly not sitting here in Chicago and doing the work we do in a consulate which covers 14 states, the size of Western Europe, the economy the size of Japan, and our engagement with our US partners, be that business, be that state government, be that cities, academia, is incredibly diverse and multifaceted. I know that Churchill was very much focused on the security relationship and the military relationship, and that was a prism he looked at everything through in his speech. But when I look at the UK-US relationship today and the UK-Midwest relationship today that we represent here in Chicago, it's so much more. So, I look at our economic ties developing at pace. We're negotiating a free trade agreement between the UK and the US at the moment. We're hoping that talks on that will restart again very soon. And that's going to offer all kinds of opportunities and economic new horizons for both countries, for both the US and the UK. So it's not one-sided in any way at all. When we look at global issues like tackling climate change together, that's something that we're very much doing together, with the UK chairing the G7 at the moment, having the G7 presidency. We are talking to the US all the time about tackling that global challenge as we lead up to hosting COP26. And that's even before we get onto other areas of collaboration like science, innovation, like tech, as the ambassador said. Just in the Midwest, 15 out of the top 200 global universities, research universities, are here in the Midwest. Many of them have really close ties with the UK. So we're seeing technical innovation come about, which benefits both sides. So I don't see it as one-sided at all. I think what's going on goes way beyond just the security prism that Churchill described. It touches the economy of both countries. It touches climate and global issues, and it touches our technological future, which we're grappling with together.
Great, thank you, Alan. Now I'm going to take the privilege of being the moderator to make a comment myself, and maybe I can invite either Lawrence or Catherine to give a response. And the comment I want to make is that if Churchill were around today, he might be talking about another Iron Curtain falling. He might be talking about human rights in Hong Kong being crushed, the genocide in Xinjiang that people are talking in America and elsewhere about, the threats to democracy in Taiwan. Do you think it's important to understand the special relationship in the context of Britain and America having a common opponent, a common sense of threat from outside? And clearly in 1945, the common threat was emerging as the Soviet Union. Before that, the common threat was Nazi Germany. Do you think Churchill today would be seeing the rise of China not only as a sort of threat when it comes to technology and an economic threat, but a threat to our values, a threat to democracy and to human rights? I don't know if either Catherine or Lawrence has a view on jumping in on that comment.
Let me try, if I may. First of all, I've always wondered what the term special relationship means. Really have. And over the 40-odd years I've lived mostly in Chicago and then occasionally in London, I've been asked the question a lot. And I came to the conclusion that it's a close relationship, a very close relationship, but neither country can afford it to be a unique relationship. And so it can't be special to the exclusion of others. I am also, as a businessman, reminded that the two countries, the UK and the US, are the largest investors in each other's country. There's over 1 million workers working for UK companies in the US and vice versa in the UK. There's a lot of special features, but it is a global relationship. So they don't need a common enemy, because the common values they do share, the Western values, the English-speaking values, and you can't get away from that which started early on has stayed. And the ambassador so eloquently put it, the rule of law onwards. So it is that. I do think that there is no doubt that a man of Churchill's ilk would have recognized the dangers of hegemony and to the values of the Western world. China isn't the only oligopolist out there, but it is clear that there is a test of strength and a test of wills. Short-term democratic governments, along with presidents for life in essentially a dictatorial thing, is a test of wills. And it is a question of the Western values against dictatorship, clear dictatorship and autocracy. So I can't believe that a man of Churchill's ilk and others won't recognize that and won't be stalwart in the defense of it. So, yeah, I think he would.
Right, thank you. Just before I get Catherine to respond, I'm going to urge those of you who are watching this to submit your own questions, because in about 15 minutes, I'll turn to the audience questions. I'd love to give everyone who's watching the chance to submit their own and to have those raised. But Catherine, do you want to respond either to my comment or to Lawrence's one?
Sure. I think that what Ambassador Pierce described as the common bond, not only in culture and language and history, but also the shared values of our legal systems and the common law. And I think that you can't separate that from the elements of history and culture as well that the United States and Britain share and have shared for such a long time. And over the course of Churchill's career, he was certainly an early warning voice of the rise of authoritarianism and abuses of human rights in different places of the world. I mean, of course, most specifically, we think of him, calling out Nazi Germany and the rise of the Soviet threat, and the absolute disregard of the Declaration of Liberated Europe, which they had signed at Yalta, which was clearly being refuted every day by the Soviets on the ground in Eastern Europe in the immediate aftermath. So, I mean, it's of course purely speculative to think of what Churchill might have said specifically in China with human rights abuses or elsewhere in the world. But one can imagine that were leaders like Churchill and Roosevelt around today, the fact that Churchill was often the one kind of raising early alarm about certain crises in the world, and that the United States eventually followed in that line of reasoning in defense of the democratic principles and rights of individuals. I think a lot of that is because there is such a shared commitment to those principles through our common law history. and that is something that you can imagine kind of just the natural trend of events, and the defense of democracy and individual rights is something that, were they alive today, you can't help but think that that would be something that would certainly be in line with what they would have argued in 1940, 1942.
That sounds absolutely right. Thank you. Alan, can I come back to you? I think you similar roles in a way, that we're based in Chicago but encouraged to roam as widely across the Midwest as possible. And I know that before I arrived here 3 years ago, I tended to think of the Midwest as being this very monochrome, sort of predominantly white part of America. And one thing that struck me as I've explored the region is to understand, of course, how it's much richer than that. It's this great variety of demography, and how there's Latino corners and African American corners, and the rise of Asian Americans in Chicago and so on. It strikes me that as the demography of America changes, is it necessarily then going to change the relationship that Britain has with America? For example, I was struck when Ambassador Pierce talked about we think in English. Well, what if Americans less and less do think in English? What if they're thinking in Spanish or thinking in Vietnamese or something else? How does America changing within itself perhaps shift the relationship it has with, old historic ties with countries like Britain?
I think that's an extremely important point that you raised, Adam. And yes, I mean, like you, I came not knowing quite what to expect with the Midwest. Of course, about the industrial side of the history and all the rest. To find just such a diverse economy across a range of sectors has been really, really quite exciting. But on the demographic point, I completely agree with you. One thing that has struck me in the fairly limited travel that I've done in the 1 year that I've been here, most of which has been in Chicago itself, not beyond, unfortunately, at this stage. But I tend to come across a lot of people who have deep affection for the UK, but it's often through a prism of traditionalism. It's through a filter of military history, common history in that sense. And I think it's really important that, Churchill talked in his speech about common citizenship. What does common citizenship look like for your average young British person or your average young American today in their teens or early 20s who perhaps doesn't have English as their first language, as you say? I think it's hugely important for the future of the UK-US relationship to make that bilateral relationship relevant for those people, to give it the same kind of visceral connection that the previous generations perhaps felt because of the military history. How do we do that? I think it's really important that we create as many opportunities as possible to bring people together, including particularly through the creative industries. The British Council recently did a survey of people aged 18 to, I think, 30 in both countries. And by far, the most powerful currency of connection, and for those people, when it came to the UK-US dynamic, was the arts, whether that's music or film or anything else. So I think it's hugely important that when the UK speaks and the UK government speaks, it's as relevant to your 18-year-old who has Spanish as their first language as it is to someone who really resonates with the military history that we have. Great, thank you. Catherine or Lawrence, I'm not sure who to throw this one to. So again, you might just sort of see who has the most appetite for it, but it was touched on in the Fireside Chat by Ivo. Do we think of the special relationship being primarily about the relations between the leaders? If Churchill has a good relationship with FDR, great. But if Blair doesn't have a great relationship with Bill Clinton, or some other tie between the two leaders, then there's a problem. Or do we need to think about the relationship more as one of institutions and one of cultural ties and those things at the ground level up? I ask this because, as Ivo mentioned, now and then you have these embarrassing things that a leader might say about another leader, and I have to bring it up because it's fun to remind everyone that Joe Biden, during his campaign to become president, called Boris Johnson the physical and emotional clone of Donald Trump. So a rather rude comment from Joe Biden about the British Prime Minister, and yet they now work on having a wonderfully good relationship. So how do you see the relations going? Is it between the personalities or is it between the institutions?
I think that's a common debate in history about whether it's it's about are personalities determinative of the future, Or is it kind of the constraints of geography and natural resources that set you on a path that's predetermined, where you'll naturally clash with certain nations and cooperate with others? I think that there's a middle ground between that. Certainly, certain individuals can have an outsized impact on history. Churchill and Roosevelt, of course, always held up as the standard of those. But I think that there are natural, again, because the system of laws and commitment to democracy, that there are certain elements that we would pursue kind of regardless of who is in charge in both places. However, I do think that there is the potential that, while one individual may not be able to chart a completely different path in history, I think that there are sometimes you can think of downside risks with certain individuals in leadership that there might not be with others. So not that it's completely out of the hands of the individual. I certainly think that there is kind of room within parameters of how different outcomes can be, kind of those parameters being set by those other predetermined factors such as geography, natural resources, and alliance commitments, things like that. But there's certainly within that bandwidth, there is room, I think probably more on the downside, where one individual can make a more lasting difference in the ultimate outcome.
Great.
But not all relationships start as rosy. Churchill and Roosevelt didn't start out best of friends either, so it's fine.
Lawrence, get in.
First of all, I'd like to comment on something you and Alan both touched on. It's not just the United States that has changed its demographic complexion. If you will, I spend more time in London nowadays than I do in Chicago, and as I travel around, not just London, but I travel around the UK, I am stunned by how society has changed in the 30, 40 years that I've been flitting back and forward, how it is a polyglot society, in a multinational society. I'm privileged to run to be chancellor of one of London's big universities. It's now 55% ethnic minorities. It's a very different world today. So I think in different nationalities, but it very much mirrors the evolution of the United States. And I couldn't agree more about the creative arts. Since we first exported the Beatles, and the Ed Sullivan Show, and that craziness of the Pan Am plane landing there, it's very much cultural, and technology has made it thus, and it will ever be thus. So I do think that, having known every US president since Jimmy Carter and most of the UK prime ministers, I'm privileged that we have a prime minister that's a Churchillian and has written a book that's actually sold so far only more than Catherine, but Catherine will catch him. Catherine will catch Boris. No doubt I'll tell him that too. I do think that the tone of the relationship is set by the leadership to a point, but you cannot avoid the cultural, the business links, etc. So yes, the headlines go to the leaders, but pragmatic reality, tourism, creative arts, business, technology, interchange, that really does set the tone. You can bang on the drum, but you still need the rest of the orchestra playing, and it's the orchestra that makes the relationship.
Thank you, Lawrence.
I would just add to that, if I can come in, just as the ambassador talked about, it's the scale and the extent of the cooperation that's probably unparalleled in the world in terms of cooperation. So there's the institutional links and partnerships, whether that be on defense or security intelligence more widely, they go back decades. They are so intertwined, and that is so much more potent than any kind of combination of two individual personalities. Now, as the ambassador also said, it's the kind of near the top of the job description of any British Prime Minister to develop a positive relationship with the President of the US. So that's always going to be there. But I think if you look at the bedrock, the institutional bedrock that has been around for as long as it has, that's pretty unshakable.
Now, I feel my role here is to represent the wishes of the people viewing. And so I'm going to put a question to the three of you, and I suspect none of you will want to answer it. But the most burning question I see on my screen to my right regards a particular interview that happened this weekend in the United States and what impact that might have. There are various versions of this question that I can see, but essentially the question is, what might the fallout from the opera interview with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle be? Do any of the three of you have a view about what whether this is of any significance for the UK-US relationship, and perhaps what the role of the royal family might be in that relationship.
Well, look, I am an avowed monarchist, so let me start by that. Loving the Republic of the United States. So please start with that. Having said that, if you look at the span of time and the history, we've had wonderful kings, queens, strong kings, queens. We've had some problems between America and the United Kingdom with a certain king. So we've had a lot of this. In the fullness of time, the institution will grow, change, of the monarchy will always change and evolve with changing times. It will survive, it's strong. And I would suggest this is a mere blip in time. Great headlines, wonderful media, great money paid for $325,000 for 30 seconds of the interview the CBS earned. Perfect marketing, absolutely, this too shall pass.
I think that there's a lot of noise in the United States that may not have necessarily a direct impact on Britain or the institution of the monarchy. And I think a lot of that comes from a difference that Americans have in viewing the royal family, kind of trying to not necessarily separating celebrity from the royal family and the monarchy as an institution. So I think that's something, it's not necessarily top of mind with Americans when they see this. I also think that there is some element of, because we are not as familiar with British history, not understanding kind of the challenges that the monarchy has faced over time in its relationship with, the common people. Sometimes, they're in the right, sometimes in the wrong. But with forces like, the crown, which has been extremely popular in the United States, which I think, unfortunately, sometimes people take as reality. There are certainly elements of it that are based on fact and truth, but it is historical fiction. And unfortunately, I think there's also kind of, while we don't necessarily separate celebrity and monarchy here, there's also that kind of taking at face value historical fiction as history. And to see that, mentioned in the interview, just again, kind of commenting on this as a historian, for the crown to be a basis as a question or kind of framing the conversation for Americans, I think kind of adds to this blurring between history and policy and the public role of the monarchy as an institution and how it's represented in art and culture, which resonate but are not necessarily the same.
Alan, are you clamoring to make a comment on this, or do you want me to move on to another topic?
Well, I was going to say, Adam, I admire your restraint that it took you a full 30 minutes before you got to the question. I'm not surprised at all that it's been the most popular one after the media coverage on both sides. I mean, it won't be a surprise to you or probably anyone that British diplomats just don't comment on matters pertaining to the royal household. But I will just say that you might have seen already that the Queen has made a statement about the interview a couple of hours ago, where she expressed her concern about some of the allegations raised there. So I would just direct people to that.
Okay, great, thank you. Something I'd say, just to pick up on Catherine's point, which I think was excellent, was that there was huge interest in the royal family in the United States. When I travel around, Fulton, Missouri or wherever, people do bring it up. They do mention, what's happening with Prince William or something. It's something that people are interested in. And I imagine that for the British tourism industry, for the British cultural industry, all sorts of advantages come from having such very, very high profile celebrities that are well known in the United States. So it is an enormous interest here. But as Lawrence says, this particular fuss will pass. Lawrence, I want to take you back to history. The next most popular question on our list is about the relationship that Churchill had with President Truman and how that might have compared with FDR. Was Churchill able to create a good personal relationship with Truman? And if not, why not?
A lot has been written about it. You talk about the Fulton trip. I actually have behind me a photo of Truman and Churchill in a car going to the gymnasium in Fulton, Missouri, where he gave the speech. They forged a working relationship, but it wasn't the deep relationship that he forced with Roosevelt that turned into mutual respect and friendship. I think they both had very pragmatic views of what each were doing. It was a mutual situation. I think Truman was more suspicious of it. And Churchill was a lot older at that stage, having had heart attacks and so on during the war. So I think it wasn't the same depth of relationship. It was clearly mutual respect, and the Fulton, Missouri situation, the opportunity that Harry Truman put up is mark of that. It wasn't the same relationship, but it was a relationship of mutual respect. And I would even go further to suggest it's a relationship that many of the presidents and prime ministers of the UK have forged of similar ilk since that time.
Great, thank you.
Catherine's probably more of an expert on it because she can actually read a book. I just listen to them.
Catherine, do you have something to add, or should we move on to another topic?
I completely agree with Lawrence. It was a more functional relationship based on mutual respect and admiration and a necessity of meeting kind of common goals rather than the deep personal friendship. But I mean, they certainly were very friendly. I mean, they're also the fathers of daughters who were involved in the arts. And at one point, Sarah Churchill, his daughter, who was an actress, was performing in the Philadelphia story near Washington, D.C., and the Truman family came to see her in the play. Margaret Truman similarly was a singer. And so, I mean, there were elements that were friendly and more of a genuine friendship kind of between families as well, but not to the same depth and extent with Roosevelt and the Roosevelt family.
Great, thank you. Well, the next question brings us back to the present, and I don't know if that means, Alan, that you're on duty to take it, but it's a question about Brexit, you'll be pleased to hear. And the questioner wants to know whether the fact of Brexit having happened makes the special relationship more special in some way. Is it more important after Brexit than it was before? And that relates perhaps to a different question we had from a Dutch viewer, watcher, a European, who says he or she sees an almost exclusive friendship between the US and the UK, almost as if that friendship was excluding others. And the questioner wants to know whether that somehow damages the ability for there to be special relationships between the US and other European countries. So 2 questions on how Britain's relationship with Europe affects its relationship with the US.
I think it would be a tricky word, special, because people can project so much onto it. It can mean so many things to different people. I'll come back to something Lawrence said, I think it was, who the relationship might be extremely deep, and some people might characterize it as special, but it doesn't mean it's exclusive. And I think Churchill even picks up on this in his Fulton speech when he talks about my father's house has many mansions within the context of multiple alliances. So the UK-US relationship he saw was not at the expense of alliances with other like-minded partners, and I think the same goes now in the modern age. You just need to look at multilateral fora like the G7, the G20, others, the United Nations, the Quad. There are lots and lots of groupings where the UK and the US are working much more widely with like-minded partners. I think what's important is that both are committed to a coalition of open societies, and any kind of sense of exclusivity, I think, is the wrong way to look at it. And coming back to Brexit, has Brexit made special even more special? Well, I would say that it's created new opportunities. And particularly economic opportunities, because of course, when the UK was a member state of the European Union, trade policy was very much European Union competence. The UK did not have the freedom to make its own trade agreements, negotiate its own trade policy, and implement it. That, of course, has changed. And I come back to what I mentioned earlier, the free trade agreement negotiation. We could not do that before. And it allows us to forge our own path in terms of pursuing opportunities which are in the UK's and the US's interests. I think that opens up new horizons and new possibilities that wouldn't have been as easily realized when we were members of the European Union.
I wonder if either Catherine or Lawrence, you want to touch on how other countries in Europe might see the relationship. I lived in France for 3 years, and when Trump came to visit Macron in Paris, for example, they made a big point of saying what I think Joe Biden also said a month ago, which is that France is the oldest ally. And so the British are the most special, but the French are the oldest. And perhaps with each country, you can have an adjective or a phrase that you use to establish some sort of special link. I know with India, where I also lived, they always the Americans and the Indians always talk about being the largest and oldest democracies and the importance of those ties. Do either of you have a thought on how those other parts of Europe might perceive the special relationship?
First of all, having lived in France, were I sitting with President Macron today, I would merely remind him that wisdom doesn't necessarily come with age. But that's bonjour, Monsieur Macron. So here is. I think there is an envy, and it's an Anglosphere envy. It's not the relationship; it's the English language, the English culture, how it's the symbiosis with the American, the interchange, and candidly, it's the trade over the last 4 decades, where this vast investment. Where, again, as I mentioned, the UK and the US are the largest investors in each other country. No other country can do that. So there has to be a clearly symbiotic relationship there. So I think there's envy. I think there's scale envy. I think there's cultural envy. If I mentioned I was involved with the university, there's certainly, it's the UK where the Europeans are coming. It's not just to learn English, trust me. So it is. Yeah, I'm going to say there's a little bit of Anglospheric envy, and I love it.
Catherine, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are unique relationships between the United States and countries in Europe. There's a special relationship, there's the oldest relationship, and there's also a very dynamic relationship that the United States has with Germany and has had increasingly over the second half of the 20th century and the now beginning of the 21st century. And this is a relationship that's only growing in strength and importance and dynamism, that it may not be the special relationship. It's certainly an important relationship. And I don't think that any of these relationships are mutually exclusive. I think they have elements that are overlapping and can resonate with each other. But I think there are certain, mutual objectives and priorities that the United States can have with the United Kingdom, with France, with Germany, that don't necessarily imperil the other relationships.
Great. Well, we've only got a couple more minutes of this panel to go, and I want to give you each time to say one last thing, but I want to wrap together. We've had a whole flurry of questions that deal, I guess, broadly with the topic of racial injustice or Black Lives Matter. One questioner asked, for example, before every English football match, everyone on the field takes a knee in support of Black Lives Matter, and wonders whether the common issue of inequality and the campaign to tackle inequality is something that the two countries share and that other countries have in common with those. Do you feel that the experiences of the past year of dealing with this really important issue of Black Lives Matter has been something that's maybe brought us together as well? I was struck, for example, having reported on the Black Lives Matter protests last summer, that they began here in the Midwest, spread to the rest of the United States, and then erupted in London and all over the world. So clearly there were very strong connections between this part of America and the rest of the world because of this issue. I don't know if any one of the three of you wants to have a comment on that.
Well, look, again, I will say, again, I speak from only one position, that we deliberately built our university to be a majority of minorities and a multi-ethnic society. Look, we're evolving, we're growing. Yes, there's inequalities. I always worry that the pendulum will swing too far with wokeism, culture wars, etc. Again, it'll all come to a balance. There is no question, though, that the publicity and the social media aspects of crossing the Atlantic in cyber seconds has brought people together. So I pray that the tumult will die down and change that will be evolutionary and permanent will come, but that the fanaticism on both sides of the question would lead to centrism, because centrism is needed to calm the nerves. How do I feel about taking a knee? I feel the same way about clapping for the National Health Service every Thursday in England during the crisis, applauding them. These things have a moment in time where they're most effective, but repetition diminishes the effectiveness. So I don't think it serves its purpose ad infinitum, but it's symbolic more than anything else. Let me just finish my last thing with what I started, is that Churchill's parting words to Parliament were never be separated from the United States. And I would hope that the United States would want never to be separated from the United Kingdom.
Great, thank you. Catherine, do you think 75 years on, the relationship is as strong as it was back then?
I think that 75 years on, yes, I do think it is in different ways. It's easy to look at, that wartime period, the immediate aftermath, as kind of the zenith of the British and American relationship. I think, having written a book now about the Yalta Conference, the relationship wasn't as strong then as we might think that it was. Everything has to do with nuance. It certainly was, built on a personal friendship, but that personal friendship had frayed by 1945, and a new relationship was beginning with Churchill with Truman in 45 and 46, one that Truman was advocated for privately, but at the time of the Iron Curtain speech wasn't overwhelmingly positive in his endorsement of Churchill's speech publicly. And so I think that, yes, because of the common history and culture and institutions and the mutual goals that we have in, defeating, the COVID, getting the world back on its feet, building back better in both places. I think there's enough room for mutual collaboration and cooperation that we want this special relationship to be as strong now as it was then. And certainly there's so much room to grow. Great, thank you. Alan, I'm going to give you the last word with the same question. Do you see the relationship as strong now as it was 75 years ago?
Thanks, Adam. I'm just coming back really briefly to the racial justice question. I think it's an absolutely fundamental aspect of our conversation with the US. It's been, I think something has changed, and rightly so. And I think it's really important for both of our countries, and no matter what we do, whether that's looking at a trade agreement, whether that's talking about people-to-people links with academic exchanges, to make sure that the rights and the interests of every community, especially marginalized communities, are protected and promoted as much as possible. But coming back to the special relationship, I think 75 years have passed since the speech. I think the sinews of peace, which Churchill talked about, have been challenged and stretched and pushed to the limits at times because of all the global challenges that the UK and the US have had to tackle together. But importantly, they have not broken. The sinews have not torn. They are still there. The relationship, I think, is still as important and as dynamic as ever. And I think what's important is that all of us build on that legacy to make sure that we're continuing in our cooperation to promote peace and global prosperity for everybody.
Great. Well, thank you. We're out of time, but I'd like to thank all three of you for a fascinating and wide-ranging conversation. Alan, Catherine, and Lawrence, thanks so much, and look forward to chatting again sometime.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks,
very
Adam.
much.